Some places were never meant to be disturbed. They hold on to the past, clinging to the echoes of tragedy, whispers of the forgotten, and the restless spirits who refuse to leave. These places aren't just haunted, they're cursed. Tonight, we uncover 3 locations where the dead do not rest and the living are never safe. Deep within the crumbling corridors of Blackwood Asylum, beyond the main halls haunted by known torments, lay a sealed-off section known only as the Forgotten Ward. This wing, abandoned after a series of inexplicable tragedies, had become a silent repository for the asylum's darkest secrets. For decades, whispers had circulated among urban explorers and local historians alike. Stories of unearthly cries, spectral figures, and the sense of being followed by unseen eyes. Few dared speak its name aloud, for it was said that the ward was cursed by the suffering of those who had been trapped within its walls. Dr. Henry Caldwell, a retired psychiatrist whose fascination with the human mind had long bordered on obsession, had studied the annals of Blackwood Asylum since his early career. He had read every report, every faded photograph, and every anecdote passed down by former staff. Yet nothing intrigued him more than the legend of the Forgotten Ward. Determined to uncover the truth behind the sealed section, Dr. Caldwell embarked on a solitary expedition to the asylum, armed only with his research notes and a steadfast resolve to confront the past. On a cold, overcast morning, Dr. Caldwell arrived at the derelict asylum. The building, now a ruin of its former self, exuded an aura of decay and neglect. With measured steps, he made his way through the main entrance and navigated the labyrinthine corridors lined with peeling paint and rusted metal fixtures. His footsteps echoed softly in the oppressive silence, each step drawing him closer to the wing that had long been shuttered off from the rest of the world. At the end of a narrow corridor, behind a heavy, barred door marked with a date from decades past, lay the entrance to the Forgotten Ward. Dr. Caldwell's hands trembled as he produced a set of keys he had acquired through painstaking research. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped into a space that seemed suspended in time. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of countless unspoken sorrows. The room was lit only by the weak, diffused light that managed to penetrate the broken windows, casting long shadows across rows of empty, decaying beds and tattered patient files strewn about the floor. Every surface bore the scars of neglect, scuffed walls, cracked tiles, and peeling wallpaper that hinted at the ward's once sterile appearance. Yet beneath the physical decay, Dr. Caldwell sensed an intangible presence, a residue of anguish and torment that permeated the space. As he walked slowly through the desolate hall, his mind wandered back to the stories he had read. The records described a series of experiments conducted on patients deemed unfit for treatment. These experiments, shrouded in secrecy, had involved procedures so brutal that even the most hardened medical professionals recoiled at their mention. The patients, it was rumored, had been subjected to treatments that stripped away not only their sanity but also their very souls. In their final moments, many had cried out in agony, a chorus of despair that had echoed through the ward long after their deaths. Dr. Caldwell paused before one of the patient rooms, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. He recalled the account of a nurse who had once whispered about the lingering spirit of a young woman, whose laughter had turned to screams in the wake of unspeakable horrors. He pushed the door open, and in that instant, a chill swept over him. The room was small, its single bed unmade and stained, a testament to the suffering that had once occurred there. In the corner, a broken mirror lay shattered on the floor, its fragments reflecting a distorted, fragmented image of the room. With each careful step, Dr. Caldwell felt the boundary between past and present dissolve. The oppressive silence was broken only by the soft shuffle of his own footsteps and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of something that might have been a whisper. He could not be sure if it was merely the wind or something more, a spectral echo of the pain that had once saturated this very space. As he continued his exploration, Dr. Caldwell discovered a faded journal tucked beneath a dusty pile of patient records. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages within were filled with desperate scrawlings. The journal belonged to a patient named Eleanor, whose entries recounted a gradual descent into madness. Eleanor wrote of recurring nightmares, of voices that called her name in the dead of night, and of a presence that lurked in the dark corners of the ward. Her final entry, written in trembling handwriting, read, "They took away my hope, and now I am left with only shadows. I see them everywhere, watching, waiting for the moment when I will join them." The weight of Eleanor's words pressed upon Dr. Caldwell's heart, and he felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow for the lost souls condemned to this forsaken place. As he closed the journal, the temperature in the room seemed to drop further, and the very atmosphere grew heavier, laden with the palpable energy of anguish and despair. In that moment, Dr. Caldwell became acutely aware of the subtle shift in his surroundings. It was as though the ward itself had awakened, stirred by his presence and his earnest desire to understand its mysteries. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the walls, and he could have sworn that a figure moved at the edge of his vision, a fleeting glimpse of a pale, sorrowful face that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His rational mind struggled to dismiss the vision as a trick of the light, yet his instincts screamed that something otherworldly was at work. Driven by a mixture of trepidation and scholarly curiosity, Dr. Caldwell ventured deeper into the ward. In one small, confined room, he found a series of cryptic drawings etched into the wall. The images were disturbing, abstract, contorted figures that seemed to writhe in torment, interspersed with symbols he recognized from his studies of occult lore. The drawings, created in a frenzied scrawl, hinted at a ritual of desperation, a final attempt by the patients to break free from their suffering. As he examined the markings, a profound sense of melancholy washed over him, as if the very essence of despair had been captured in those lines and curves. Throughout his exploration, Dr. Caldwell documented his findings meticulously, aware that every detail could be a key to unraveling the ward's tragic history. Yet as the hours passed, his initial resolve began to waver. The oppressive atmosphere and the echoes of past torments bore down upon him, and he felt his own mind start to question the boundaries between objective observation and the subjective horrors that the ward invoked. Was it possible that the suffering of the forgotten souls was beginning to seep into his own consciousness? As twilight began to merge with the deepening gloom of night, Dr. Caldwell retraced his steps back to the entrance of the forgotten ward. In the final moments before closing the heavy door behind him, he took one last, lingering look at the room, a silent farewell to the tortured past that resided there. The ward, with its broken remnants and shattered memories, had revealed a harrowing narrative of despair and human cruelty that no amount of scholarly detachment could ever fully erase. Back in the crumbling corridor outside, Dr. Caldwell allowed himself a moment of reflection. The experience had left him with more questions than answers. Questions about the nature of suffering, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ways in which the past can haunt the present. The secrets of the forgotten ward were not meant to be understood easily, for they were woven into the very fabric of Blackwood Asylum, a legacy of pain that had transcended time. In the days that followed, Dr. Caldwell shared his findings with a select circle of colleagues and historians. His meticulous notes, the journal of Eleanor, and the haunting drawings on the wall sparked intense debates and further investigations. While many dismissed his account as the ravings of a man too deeply affected by the horrors of the past, others found in his words a chilling validation of long-held suspicions about the asylum's darkest chapter. For Dr. Caldwell, the journey into the forgotten ward was both an act of professional inquiry and a personal reckoning. It reminded him that some places harbor echoes of the past that can never be silenced, that the ghosts of suffering can persist long after the living have forgotten their names. And as he continued his work, he remained haunted by the quiet, persistent thought that the ward's sorrowful energy was not confined to the decaying walls of Blackwood Asylum. It had followed him out into the world, a spectral reminder that some wounds, once inflicted, never truly heal. In the end, the forgotten ward became a part of his legacy, a cautionary tale about the perils of delving too deeply into the recesses of human despair. It was a story that spoke not only of institutional cruelty and lost hope, but also of the enduring impact of those who had suffered in silence. And though the sealed door of the ward now stood closed to the outside world, its secrets continued to echo in the minds of those who dared to listen, whispering a sorrowful warning to all who would seek to uncover the past. The Blackwood Asylum had been abandoned for 70 years, yet the locals swore they could still hear screams coming from inside. Once a towering institute for the mentally ill, Blackwood was home to the discarded, the forgotten. Patients were locked away, their conditions misunderstood, their suffering ignored. The worst of them were subjected to experimental treatments, electroshock therapy, lobotomies performed with rusted tools, and ice baths that left skin peeling from the bone. In 1951, a fire swept through the asylum, killing over 200 patients and staff. The official report stated that a patient started it, but the locals whispered a different story. They said the asylum was damned long before the flames came, that something inside wanted everyone dead. No one dared enter the ruins, until Jason. A self-proclaimed urban explorer, Jason had spent years hunting abandoned places, filming them for his growing audience. The stories about Blackwood intrigued him. But they weren't real, right? Just folklore? He arrived at the asylum just after sunset. The building loomed over him, its brickwork crumbling, windows like hollow eyes watching his every move. His first steps inside sent dust spiraling into the air. The scent of mildew and decay hung thick. His flashlight swept across the empty halls, revealing rusted wheelchairs, overturned gurneys, and patient records strewn across the floor. Then he heard it. A whisper. It came from room 306. A notorious cell where, according to legend, a patient had been left alone for years, locked away until she wasted to nothing but bones and screams. Jason swallowed hard and pushed open the door. The room was empty, but his breath turned to mist. The temperature dropped, and then scratching. It came from inside the walls, slow at first, then frantic, desperate. Jason's heartbeat thundered in his ears. A shuffling sound echoed down the hall. He spun around. A shadow darted past the doorway. Not a trick of the light, not his imagination. Something was there. Jason stepped back. The floor groaned beneath him. His flashlight flickered. And then, a shriek. The walls trembled, his vision blurred. And in the doorway stood a woman, her hospital gown torn, her fingers blackened, her face twisted into a silent scream. Jason turned to run, but the door slammed shut. The whispering voices grew louder. The woman's mouth opened wider and wider, until her entire face was a gaping black void. And then, darkness. The next morning, his camera was found outside the asylum, still recording. The last frame? Jason's wide, horrified eyes staring into the lens, and behind him, the woman's face stretching into an unnatural, hungry grin. Deep in the countryside, beyond the last stretch of road, stood the forsaken church of Ravenswood. The church had been built in the late 1800s, a beacon for the town's devout. But something happened, something no one could explain. One Sunday morning, the congregation gathered for worship. The doors were locked from the inside. No one left. When the town sheriff broke in days later, the pews were filled with rotting corpses, all sitting upright, facing the pulpit. The priest stood at the altar, a knife plunged into his own throat. The church was abandoned after that. But at night, passers-by claimed they heard the organ playing by itself. Lucas and his friends didn't believe in ghost stories. They were young, fearless, and eager to prove the town's fears were nothing but myths. One night, they drove out to the forsaken church with flashlights and cameras. The doors creaked open at their touch. Inside, the air was thick, stale. Cobwebs clung to the rafters. The wooden pews remained in perfect rows, as if the congregation had never left. At the front of the church, the pulpit stood untouched, and behind it, the organ, a massive, looming structure covered in dust. "Let's play a note," Lucas grinned, brushing off the keys. As his fingers pressed down, the sound echoed through the church, deep, unnatural, vibrating through the floor. And then, the whispering began, low at first, then louder. Lucas turned to his friends. Their faces had gone pale. They weren't alone. A shadow moved between the pews, slow, watching. And then they saw him, a priest, his cassock covered in stained crimson, his eyes two hollow pits. His head twitched to the side in an unnatural snap. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. The doors slammed shut. The organ began to play by itself, a hymn, a funeral march. The friends ran, but Lucas felt a hand on his shoulder. He was yanked backward. His scream never left his throat. By the time his friends got outside, Lucas was gone. The only thing left behind was his flashlight, flickering near the pulpit. And the organ? It kept playing, long after they had fled. For years, travelers vanished from the Devil's Hollow Motel, always from room 306. Sophia, a journalist, thought it was just another urban legend. She was wrong. Determined to prove the stories false, she booked a single night in room 306. The motel was old. The walls sagged, the carpets reeked of mildew, but the room itself, perfectly normal, until 3:06 a.m. The mirror fogged over, though there was no heat. And then, writing appeared. "Let me in." Her breath caught. A slow creaking sound came from the closet. It wasn't open before. And standing there, a figure, too tall, too twisted, its limbs bent at the wrong angles, its smile too wide. "You're already inside," it whispered. The motel twisted around her, the walls shifted, the floor stretched, and then she screamed. The next morning, the motel manager knocked on room 306. No response. Inside, the bed was untouched, the room was empty. Only one thing was left behind. A message on the mirror. "She let me in." Some places should remain forgotten. Some doors should never be opened. Because once you step inside, you may never find your way out. Sleep well, if you can.